Hello everyone, my name is Valerie Wood and this is Public Policy. I'm going to be going over Chapter 7 in Theories of the Policy Process by Christopher Weible and Paul A. Sabatier, which covers the topic of innovation and diffusion in governments. To put it more simply, we're going to be looking at what factors lead governments to adopt new ideas, particularly processes previously adopted by other jurisdictions, as well as what factors might stop them from doing so. We're also going to be looking at a paper written by Daniel M. Butler, Craig Volden, Adam M. Dynes, and Boris Shor entitled Ideology, Learning, and Policy Diffusion, Experimental Evidence. This paper looks at whether or not a politician's ideology might come into play when deciding whether or not to adopt a policy. With that being said, our goals for Chapter 7 are to review the dominant theories of government innovation in public policy literature, show how these theories are very similar to other ideas developed to explain innovative behavior by individuals, and then show that these theories about government innovation actually have a lot in common with theories that attempt to explain innovation at the organizational level. Chapter 7 focuses on work done by Francis Stokes Berry and William D. Berry. According to Berry and Berry, there seem to be two primary explanations for what leads a government to adopt new and innovative programs. The first of these explanations is that of internal determinants. Now, with internal determinants, the reason why a jurisdiction might be motivated to innovate are going to be political, economic, or social issues that are happening within their jurisdiction, and therefore are going to have no diffusion effects. The second of these explanations is that of diffusion explanations. Now, opposed to the explanation of internal determinants, this explanation is inherently intergovernmental. This explanation sees the adoption of policies as imitations of previous policies within other governments, and therefore they are not impacted by internal factors. Now, the truth is that neither of these can actually fully explain the whole of policy diffusion and innovation. It's probably going to be a mix of the two with some additional factors coming into play, but most imperial research before 1990 focused on one of these types of processes or the other. So we're going to start off by looking at diffusion explanations for policy adoption. In the 1995 publication of Diffusion of Innovations, Everett M. Rogers defines diffusion as the process by which an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among the members of a social system. However, the authors of the book say that a more general definition is that policy diffusion happens when the probability of one government jurisdiction adopting a policy is influenced by the choices of other governments in that same system. However, there's at least 5 mechanisms that enable diffusion to occur, and these 5 mechanisms are learning, imitation, normative pressure, competition, and coercion. The first mechanism for diffusion is learning. When policy is diffused by learning, policymakers in one jurisdiction get information about either the effectiveness or success of a policy from governments that have already implemented it. We can say that this diffusion has happened via learning when the likelihood of a government adopting the policy is influenced by whether or not that government thinks the policy has been effective in other governments. The second mechanism for diffusion is imitation. If a policy is diffused via imitation, policymakers in country A will consider country B worthy of imitation, which will influence them to follow country B's policies regardless of whether or not they're effective. This might seem a little overly simplistic, but the truth is that governments may attempt to imitate a variety of jurisdictions. Policymakers sometimes turn to what they consider to be leader governments. Policymakers often prefer to imitate jurisdictions that have similar party and ideological orientations. The primary difference between imitation and learning is that imitation focuses on the actor, which is the other government, whereas learning focuses on the action, which is the policy being implemented. The third mechanism for diffusion is normative pressure. If a government adopts a policy due to normative pressure, they aren't doing it out of a desire to imitate a government that they admire. They're doing so just because they see many other governments around them doing so, and because of shared norms, they choose to conform. I personally like to call this the peer pressure mechanism of diffusion, just the same as how peer pressure isn't always bad, normative pressure isn't always bad either. For example, peer pressure was responsible for raising millions of dollars for ALS research back when the Ice Bucket Challenge was circulating on social media. But more recently, it's also been responsible for a trash your classroom trend that was circulating on TikTok. Similarly, you can see states succumbing to pressure to enact legislation that others have enacted, and similar to what you see with peer pressure in a social context, these can have either positive or negative consequences. The fourth mechanism for diffusion is competition. In this scenario, a government has decided to adopt a policy based solely on the desire to have an economic advantage over another area, or to limit the advantages that another jurisdiction can have over it. In the book, the authors make the point to mention that in diffusion via learning, other governments generate new information about the costs and benefits of implementing certain policies, but if ideas are being diffused via competition, the adoptions made by other governments are going to alter the benefits of adopting that said policy. Now, within the mechanism of competition, there are in turn two distinct types of competition. First, you have the location choice competition, in which a government will try to influence the decisions of those who can obtain something, whether that be a good or a service, in more than one jurisdiction, usually their own and at least one other. Jurisdiction A will implement a policy that encourages people to obtain something that's favorable for A to offer, as opposed to going somewhere else. Some examples of this are the lottery, casinos, welfare benefits, tax rates, and some various business regulations. Second, you have the spillover-induced competition. If Government A adopts a policy that has positive effects on both Government A and Government B is going to be less likely to adopt the policy, choosing instead to free ride on the policies of A. The book gives the example of one government adopting a pollution abatement project that would reduce pollution for both jurisdictions. If Government A adopts this policy, but it leads to less pollution in both jurisdictions, Jurisdiction B isn't really going to be motivated to adopt the policy because they're already benefiting from Government A's work. The last mechanism for diffusion is called coercion, or what I like to call the carrot or the stick. If Government B is adopting a policy because the more powerful Government A has done something that makes Government B more likely to adopt this policy, then we would say that this diffusion has occurred due to coercion. This coercion can be either good or bad. The more powerful government might offer a positive incentive for adopting this policy, or they might penalize them for not adopting it. Either way, if the decision to adopt the policy is solely driven by the incentive provided by another government, this diffusion is said to have happened via coercion. Now, it's important to remember that these mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. Multiple mechanisms can influence policy diffusion in multiple ways. Additionally, the mechanisms responsible for the diffusion might vary depending on the context in which the diffusion occurred. For example, the mechanism can vary with the characteristics of the state, or over time, or it could be influenced by the nature of the policy itself. The important thing to remember is that when governments make public policy, they often copy what other governments have already done, and one or more of the aforementioned mechanisms can explain why. Looking at the three models that were the most popular when policy innovation was first studied and how they are similar to the 5 mechanisms of diffusion that we just went over, we find 3 models. The first is the national interaction model, the second is the regional diffusion model, and the last is the leader-laggard model. The national interaction model assumes that policy diffuses via learning, whereas the regional diffusion model and the leader-laggard model are both compatible with multiple mechanisms of diffusion that we just discussed. The national interaction model was developed by communication theorists who were looking at the diffusion of innovation through a social system consisting of individuals. In equation form, this model can be expressed as is displayed on the slide, but for your sanity and my own, I am not going to try to read that out to you. The following is the text breakdown of the formula, though. In this model, L is the proportion of individuals in the social system who are potential adopters, which is a value assumed to remain constant over time, and serves as a ceiling on possible adoptions. If every person in the system is unconstrained and may adopt, L equals 1. N of t is the cumulative proportion of adopters in the social system at the end of time period t. N of t minus 1 is the cumulative proportion at the end of the previous period, and thus delta N of t is the proportion of new adopters during period t. I hope you guys got that. The national interaction model assumes that there's a national communication network among state officials, and that officials from states that have already adopted a program interact freely and mix thoroughly with officials from other states. Each contact by a not yet adopting state with a previous adopter provides an additional stimulus for the former to adopt. Additionally, the model assumes that all potential adopters are equally likely to adopt the policies, and it treats all actors as totally undifferentiated actors who interact randomly. When the social system is a large group of people, and the goal of the research is to describe the diffusion process at the macro level, this theory is a good fit. When studying how a new consumer product spreads through a large group of people, it might be enough to use a model that assumes random interactions. But several factors limit this model's usefulness when discussing government innovation. For one thing, when looking at how a policy spreads across 50 states, it doesn't really make sense to treat these states as undifferentiated units. It's also likely that contacts between officials from different states aren't going to be random. The regional diffusion model says that governments are mostly influenced by other governments that are close by. Most of these models assume that governments are influenced solely by their adjacent jurisdictions. In other words, that the likelihood of a government adopting a certain policy is directly related to the number of nearby jurisdictions that have already adopted it. There are two variants of the regional diffusion model, the fixed region and the neighbor model. While both of these emphasize neighbor replication, their impact routes differ. Fixed region models assume that all governments within an area have the same influence channels. In contrast, neighbor models presume that each government has its own set of reference for cues on public sector advances. There are policies that fit a neighbor model better than a fixed region model, but neither is entirely accurate or practical. Fixed region models assume that certain jurisdictions are completely unaffected by their neighbors. According to neighbor models, jurisdictions that are nearby but don't share a border have no impact on each other. A more realistic regional diffusion model would suggest that jurisdictions are impacted mostly by their neighbors, but also by other jurisdictions nearby. Theoretically, some policy dispersion is likely to be regional in nature. The regional diffusion model's flaw is that many processes for diffusion might lead to the assumption that diffusion channels are regional. This brings us to the leader-laggard model. The leader-laggard model, like regional diffusion, has multiple mechanisms for diffusion. Learning is consistent with this model, for example. Some policymakers are more risk-tolerant than others, making them more likely to implement a new untested policy, whereas policymakers in risk-averse areas might wait to adopt until they can assess the policy's performance in jurisdictions that adopted early. But this model also allows for imitation. In certain cases, authorities in one jurisdiction might be more highly respected than officials in another jurisdiction, leading policymakers to look to the more respected jurisdiction for guidance. However, there are some limitations to the leader-laggard model. In many cases, this model fails to anticipate which jurisdictions or even which type of jurisdictions are going to be leaders and which governments are going to follow. Without this theoretical prediction of which jurisdiction is going to lead and which is going to follow, a leader-laggard model is almost impossible to test. Going back to the internal determinants model that I mentioned previously, This model once again assumes that the factors causing a government to adopt a new program or policy are political, economic, or social characteristics of the jurisdiction. In other words, in its purest form, this model has a moderating effect on the extent that a government is influenced by the actions of other governments. However, this overlooks the fact that a policy made by one jurisdiction is very unlikely to be adopted by another jurisdiction completely autonomously. Media coverage and contact among government officials make it nearly certain that information about the policy is going to reach other jurisdictions one way or another. However, the internal determinants model suggests that once policymakers are aware of the policy's probability of adoption is going to be determined by internal features. This model leads us to the paper that we're going to be looking at today, which looks at how the ideology of policymakers, which could be interpreted as an internal characteristic of that jurisdiction, can influence the adoption of ideas diffused by other jurisdictions. The paper we are going to be looking at today is titled Ideology, Learning, and Policy Diffusion, Experimental Evidence by Daniel M. Butler, Craig Volden, Adam M. Dynes, and Boris Shor, which was published in the January 2017 edition of American Journal of Political Science. This study introduces experimental research design to the study of policy diffusion in order to better understand how policy ideology affects a policymaker's willingness to learn from one another's experiences. Now, this overview is not comprehensive. I'm not doing a total review of the study. There are some tables and addendums that I'm not going to be covering here because I do want to focus on the areas that relate specifically to policy diffusion without getting bogged down in the data. But if you are interested in reading the study, that link has obviously been provided. This study had 3 hypotheses, which the authors just listed by name, but for my own sanity and to try to keep them straight, I have labeled these as hypotheses A, B, and C. Hypothesis A is the ideological learning hypothesis, which theorizes that policymakers who are ideologically predisposed to adopting a policy are going to be more interested in learning about others' experiences than those who are ideologically predisposed against that policy. Hypothesis B is the success overcoming ideology hypothesis, which theorizes that evidence of policy success will significantly increase the interest in learning about others' experiences among those who are initially ideologically predisposed against a policy. Hypothesis C is the partisanship overcoming ideology hypothesis, which theorizes that evidence of policy experimentation by co-partisans will significantly increase the interest in learning about others' experiences among those who are ideologically predisposed against a policy. To test these 3 hypotheses, they used national surveys of U.S. officials produced with Qualtrics and sent to municipal authorities via email. The survey presented local policymakers with different scenarios describing zoning and foreclosure policies of other cities and offered the opportunity to, quote, learn more about these aforementioned policies. They changed important parts of these policies to see if it altered policymakers' motivation in learning. The experimental element of the research design examined whether modifying the way the government's policy experience was portrayed in the scenario might overcome ideological prejudices. The first experiment examined the role of success in combating anti-learning ideologies. Officials read about a city that had just transformed an old strip mall into a residential development and asked if they wanted to learn more about the benefits and drawbacks of a program like this to try to determine whether or not it would work in their area. As part of this test, they varied whether the city's enterprise and policy had been successful. A cross-section of policymakers' interest in learning is seen in Figure 2. Approximately 80% of the most liberal policymakers who theoretically should be inclined to be in favor of active government action did want to learn more about the policy experiences of other cities, which is consistent with the hypothesis. Conservative policymakers, on the other hand, were less enthusiastic. While the majority of conservatives did want to know more about these policies, the percentage of those who were interested dropped considerably compared to that of their more liberal counterparts. Conservatives who were informed that the policy had failed showed even less interest. Figure 3 reveals 3 key points. First, that liberal politicians' interest in learning is not tied to policy achievement. They found that 70 to 80% of them wanted to know more, whether the policy had been a success or a failure. Second, both of the lines in the figure are sloping downwards, which indicates that conservative policymakers are less interested in this issue than liberals. This fits with hypothesis A, since conservatives have the tendency to distrust government programs and are therefore less interested in knowing about them to begin with. Third, when it comes to conservative policymakers, the two lines differ dramatically. As far as the response to policy failure, we can see that the line continues on its downward trajectory. Conservatives' policy successes, on the other hand, are enough to halt this trend. This shows that the proof of success is needed to overcome the apprehensions of conservative policymakers, which confirms hypothesis B. The regions of statistically significant difference in the curves of Figure 3 are shown by the bold sections of the curves, and the magnitude of this disparity is fairly significant. All of this data shows us that conservatives demand more proof of policy success before they are willing to learn more about initiatives than they first regard with mistrust, which confirms hypothesis B. In the second experiment, the study examines partisanship's influence on policymakers' desire to learn more about housing measures to address foreclosures. This trial was given to a different subset of officials than the first experiment and portrayed a town adopting different strategies in order to deal with a spike in foreclosures. Respondents were asked if they wanted to learn more about the benefits and drawbacks of a program like this to determine whether it would work in their area. The study changed whether the strategy was implemented by Republicans or Democrats to see if the government employees preferred to learn from their own partisans. If hypothesis C is true, officials should be more interested in their own party's policies than the opposition's, especially among those ideologically opposed to these policies. Figures 4 and 5 show the results of the second experiment by plotting the average percentage of policymakers who want to learn more about the policy by ideology. Again, the data supports hypothesis A in that it finds that conservative officials are less interested in knowing about other cities' foreclosure strategies than liberal policymakers. We should expect ideological conservatives, who in this instance are almost completely Republican, to be considerably more interested in learning from members of their own party than they should be in learning from members of the opposing party if hypothesis B is correct, and this is the exact pattern that can be seen in Figure 5. The two lines in Figures 4 and 5 show locally weighted average interest in learning across treatments, with the dashed line showing the level of interest when the implementing officials are from the opposition party, and the solid line showing the level of interest when the implementing officials are from the same party as the implementing officials. They also created an additional variable of extremism in which the most conservative Republicans and most liberal of Democrats have the highest values of extremism. Adding this variable, they found that ideological extremists have greater car-partisan learning biases and that ideological extremists on both sides of the aisle prefer to learn from their political peers, which supports hypothesis C. The overall findings of this study are that, first of all, ideological biases exist even at the local and municipal levels. Secondly, it found that varying the framing of the policy success or failure, as well as the adopting government's party, influenced whether conservative policymakers wanted to learn more, which reduced their ideological biases towards learning about these programs. Lastly, it found that ideological biases can be addressed by focusing on policy success and early acceptance by co-partisans. In summary, there are 4 major takeaways from both Chapter 7 and the study that we discussed. First, we have learned that there are many mechanisms by which policy can be diffused from one jurisdiction to another. We also learned that these mechanisms are not mutually exclusive and can vary based on context. The study presented evidence that ideological prejudices can influence the adoption of learned policies, and that in order to benefit from learning-based policy diffusion, ideological prejudices must be mitigated by emphasizing the effectiveness of and copartisan interest in similar policies. That's all I have for today. Thanks for listening, and I hope you got something out of this.